Okay, I'm going to do this as an experiment. And this is basically because nobody's home right now, and I have the opportunity to record a video blog just on my own, talking about something. Um, Although maybe I haven't worked out exactly what I'm going to say, and I don't know if I'm going to post this, but I will at least record it as a experiment, right? Part of maybe I could even edit it or whatever. I don't know, but um, the topic basically has to do with decentering, and in most often cases I'm hearing this used in the context of feminism, and which means the decentering of men. And what I notice about this, as being a basically a hetero white guy male, there's something about having this kind, like, to talk about identity politics from the position of a guy who is white, heteronormative, means to assume the a certain kind of a subjectivity which has been considered a majoritarian center. And so, in the conversation about decentering, decentering means to redefine the default subjectivity in a way that's not defined by the perspective of heteronormative whiteness, maleness, and is open for that default subjectivity to be defined in other ways, right? Um, and now, like, what do I mean by like a default subjectivity, right? What I mean by a default subjectivity means that if I'm going to record a video in the way that I am doing right now, I am going to make a certain number of assumptions about the audience who would be the ones who are receiving the message from which I'm communicating, and that those some assumptions, because I don't literally have a room full of people in front of me, because I'm just recording a message to an anonymous audience, uh, I am in order to make this possible, I have to carry with me an enormous number of assumptions about the what position that my audience member have in order to make a statement that's at all coherent and meaningful and relevant to them, right? And so, because there's enough of a kind of a coherent default subjectivity in the world, you can basically confidently speak, knowing the what your audience is like, right? Now, the thing about what I've also noticed, the whole style of when this applies to things like feminism and the decentering of men and masculinity, is that it's basically implied that if you are making content that decenters men, in the sense that you're not making the assumption, you're not assuming that the people you're creating content for you have to cater to that kind of position of perspective. That the idea is that decentering men is inherently dissatisfying or not gratifying to men, right? Both from the position of if you are the occupant of the default male subjectivity, to inhabit that and to consume content that does not cater to that, is basically, there's something inherently alienating or dissatisfying about it, right? But then this sense of alienation and dissatisfaction is only relative to the alienation and dissatisfaction that would be experienced from the other way around, where if, let's say, there was a certain audience or a certain subject in mind for a certain kind of content, and then you, for whatever reason, and the thing about this is that making it all about gender coding is, I mean, sometimes it's about that, but it could, like, to give another, the easiest example that I can think of is to do with things like transportation, right? Because I think that, especially as, I mean, I don't live in the East Coast, I'm a West Coaster, but I'm a Canadian. And as a Canadian who has a certain degree of interest in these kind of topics, I have noticed that there's a political controversy in the Toronto, specifically with Doug Ford, specifically around bike lanes versus cars and stuff like that, right? And I think this is a good example in which, even if you were to look at this topic and take out everything that has to do with male, centering the white heteronormative male subjectivity front and center, you don't, there's something about the gender coding of masculinity when you apply that, let's say, to other cultures such as Islamic cultures, where they are more culturally conservative and traditional. And in the more extreme manifestations of that, you would have something like a woman is not allowed to drive a car, and a man, only the man gets to drive the car, and the man is has also a person who is goes to school maybe to become a engineer or a mechanic or a scientist or something like that, whereas the mother is more, the women are coded more into these traditional feminine roles such as caregivers, stuff like that, right? And the thing, if you think about this image, where the thing about cars specifically and the need for like engineers specialized knowledge for cars and manufacturing and technology and all this kind of stuff, is that it creates, and then the split of that between basic caregiving things like cooking and cleaning or that kind of stuff, is that if you consider the dynamic, let's say, of somebody giving a presentation in a lecture hall or something like that, the idea here is that there's a certain center of attention where you're going to have a whole bunch of people who have paid good money to focus their attention on what this one person has to say to teach, because this person has put themselves in a level of authority or a level of expertise on a certain subject, and especially when it comes to technology, this subject, there could be things like technology is only made possible by these processes of expertise and specification, right? Where the experts and the specialists have to be extremely focused on specialized knowledge, and then the communication and basically reproduction of that knowledge is then needs an environment that's highly focused, so that there's a certain, you're focusing your attention in on what is deemed to be most important and most prioritized, which is, in this sense, whoever the mastery of technical proficiency, and that if you are in this sense, if you're a man or a woman, it doesn't really matter, right? But if you also consider that in the background, while there's what's out of focus, while there's one thing is being focused on, right? In the background, you may have a necessity for people to work as janitorial staff to keep the auditorium room clean. You may have a cafeteria outside that's selling snacks and refreshments, and you may have and it's like, there's something about it where, like, you need to, if you are there paying good money to learn and you have to study the material that trains you to be a specialist, then you have to be very focused in on that special thing. And even though you would not be able to do this without being fed or without having, the area looked after by janitors and stuff like that, these people are all considered secondary support characters to the person who's at the center, who is an expert of specialized expertise knowledge, right? Now, the thing about this is that the expert who has specialized expertise knowledge has knowledge that is, it's in that situation, it's the central focus of attention, but it doesn't exist on its own in a vacuum. It only is relevant in a wider context of other, areas or fields of study or something like that, right? And what has begun to happen, I think you could say, is that we have, it's like stars that are strewn across the night sky, right? All sorts of little points of little centers that are, or like grids of points on a map, right? Where the centers that are no longer really central, they're distributed, if you see what I'm saying, right? Because you could have all sorts of specialized knowledge that or areas of expertise, and the whole point is that if you decenter masculinity, obviously what matters is whether the person has authority or expertise on a subject, not a gender thing. But then the more that if something like all the things that are in the background of that specialized expertise knowledge are still feminine encoded, or what I'm trying to say is that there's all these kind of things that if you are if you're not in the expert center of attention position, and instead you are the one who's like serving people coffee, there is something that still carries over the old codes of it being feminizing, or it being emasculating, or you being, because the point is that nobody wants to just interrupt the presentation and be like, hold on a second. Have you guys tasted how good this coffee is? Or have you guys tried those pastries? They're just to die for. Like you have to focus on the topic at hand, and that there could be an opportunity for somebody to give like a master class in catering or cooking or something like that, or to be a master chef who is like, only the elite, the highest, the most elite people all compete for reservations at this guy's restaurant or something like that. So that even caregiving, or there could be people that are so focused on their area of expertise or area of specialization that things which could be considered just part of like everyday self-care, they need to outsource to other people who are experts or specialists, right? Like, to the point where now people need to actually hire somebody to be a personal trainer, because being able to take care of your own body is something that you're unable to do on your own. You have to outsource that to somebody else because you're going to be so specialized on this one thing. You're going to have to hire another specialist to tell you how many hours you have to run on the treadmill or something like this, right? Like, so we end up getting into the situation where the more centralized you are, the more you're actually interdependent on a whole number of side characters who are there to somehow support you so that you can create this one centralized point that is a resource for other people, basically, right? And the thing about this is that in the age where the most important commodity is attention, there's still this kind of thing where what was previously coded as feminine, the supporting role, still retains this quality of being submissive, or in the sense of like not demanding attention, right? Because there's a certain thing about like whether or not the floor is swept, the lawn is mowed, the dishes are clean, the laundry is done, all these sort of things on their own, to the extent that they require attention, is really just inefficiency in the overall system, right? Like, there's all these things that need to be done in order for the overall system to run smoothly and efficiently. And so if all these little small jobs are taken care of, then this creates an efficiently working system, so that the people can focus in on the person who's delivering whatever the knowledge it is that is deemed to be the highest priority of the greatest importance, right? But then what begins to become confusing, though, is that from the perspective of, there's a certain kind of perspective of evaluation, right? Of like, to what, if our if we decide to structure our society, like I was mentioning earlier, with the conflict with bike lanes versus cars, if we think about our traffic systems, is that, and we think about this rather than men and women and those kind of coding systems, is that are we designing our roads and our traffic systems primarily for the use of cars, or are we going to design them to be shared 50-50 between cars and bicycles, or that now that there are both motorcycles as well as e-bikes that travel at a different speed, are we going to redesign our roads and our highways to accommodate a diverse range of transportation options, or are we going to take one option? The most popular one is the basic car or truck or whatever, the automobile, and we're going to take this one form of transportation and we're going to turn this into a centralized point of priority where all the other options are deprioritized for the sake of maximum efficiency of this one format, which becomes a universal standard, right? So if you take that approach, then the people who become the experts in this one thing become prioritized as central, in the sense that the whole infrastructure is built around this one approach, and the people who are experts in that approach become dominant because they're most highly valued by the selection process to select this one thing as being the best. And then, to the extent that there are all these other alternatives, that sometimes there's a certain conflict of interest that arises, because whether or not that there could be the self-interest to maintain the current dominance hierarchy, where this one thing is selected to be the central thing, which is catered to and reinforced, and all of the other things that lie outside of it are to be considered things which add unnecessary degrees of complication into the system and create inefficiency, basically, right? So for the most maximum efficiency, it becomes an entirely reductive process to eliminate all these other options and just focus on one thing that becomes repetitively reinforced over and over and over again as the only one option. And then from that position, you have a system of like total conformity, total control, total authority within that one system, which is easy to control because it's universally dominant and repeated everywhere. And the central control structure is easily replicated on top of that, right? The more you have variety and diversity, it's less easy to replicate and reproduce the central control system, because it starts creating inefficiencies, or it starts adding needs to call in different kinds of experts or to train for different ways of approaching things, right? And so this is basically. And the whole thing is that none of these areas of expertise ever exist in a vacuum. They're always existing in relation to some other area of expertise or authority, and need to work in communication with the other points of expertise or specialization, right? And in the modern era, the rise of industrialization and the rise of a technologically dominate society has happened at the same time as a movement away from monarchy towards democratic forms of government, although that seems to be a little bit shaky right now, right? But there's the idea that with the lack of a central authority in the form of a monarch or a king, instead we have an elected representative. There is the neoliberal regime has elected that the free market capitalism basically is the operating system which manages the relationships between one area of expertise and another, right? So that you have these centralized points in which they have their areas of expertise, they have relations to other centers that are distributed on a grid, basically, and what flows from one point to another and creating a system of interrelated connectivity is dominated at the moment by market dynamics, right? Buying and selling, right? And that how does one area of expertise fit with another? You need to have businessmen who hire you, who employ you, who give you money, who then have to instead of having expertise themselves, they can just say, we need somebody who's good at this, and we need somebody who's good at that, and we need somebody who's good at that, and we need to get them, put them together, get them working together, get them collaborating, and then we'll pay them money and we'll make money off of them. And that if we can make money off of it, it works. If we can't make money off of it, it doesn't work. And that becomes, we don't have the process becomes all about whatever you can do to make it financially sustainable. But whether or not there's other concerns about whether this is, there's certain ethical, moral concerns about this, whether you're exploiting labor or whether you're exploiting natural resources or whether you have environmental impacts. And the thing about that is the problem is that just unrestrained market forces on their own do not seem to really take into account these other factors, right? Because there's, it's basically, if you're only trying to figure out what makes money, there's no real guarantee that what makes money isn't going to be just destructive for the environment. So you need to have some kind of regulated authority to regulate the market for environmental reasons. But this has been very unpopular, right? Because it's created a lot of resistance to things like carbon taxes or to different environmental reforms, right? So there's need for a state, basically, a state which can direct the collaboration of different centers, different. So you can have, this whole process doesn't just end at expertise specialization, but rather that you have some kind of, basically communism is what I'm arguing for. We can have a communist state apparatus that can direct collaboration in different areas that is not just dependent on market forces. It's actually more of a deliberate, not just because the market can make money this way or that way, but we can start to look at a number of other different effects that these industries have, and that we can sort of, rather than just evaluating this whole thing from the perspective of how to keep this one area of specialization dominant and going, we can then zoom out and compare it to a wide range of other options and have this sort of this choice to choose some other direction that may have different outcomes than the path that we're currently on, right? And that there's some kind of like the problem about the being overly specialized on one very specific path is that to be overly specialized on one path at the expense of others could lead to a dynamic which is basically unbalanced, right? That you have, instead of developing a structure which can continue growing, it's like you're developing something which is leaning so far in one direction that it's bound to just like topple over and collapse, and then you're gonna have to like start up from the rubble again, right? Because you're too one-sided in a way where you think that what you've made the center is a true objective. It's like the center that you set up as the dominant thing is somehow representative as the best possible solution for it to be in harmony with all the different things going on in the world. And it's like there's some kind of basic hubris in this, right? There's some archetype of tragedy or archetype of folly in that you cannot specialize too far in any one given direction and then create something which is, in fact, the specialization is division, right? It's specializing is taking the whole range of possibilities and then dividing just one thing to focus on and specialize on and to make as the center of your attention, right? And then you create a rationale of prioritization that says this thing, which is the focus, the center of attention, needs all our focus and energy at the expense of all this other stuff, which is essentially to to make this the one thing which becomes specialized, the big phallic hard-on that regardless of whether you have women in this position or men in this position or queer or non-binary people, still that the basic function of this is to take one thing and to make this thing dominant at the expense of all the other things, and that in the whole point of this is that it's not something that goes forever. It's prone to its own force of expending its reserve of how far of what it has to spend, right? Like at some point in time, you're like, oh, this one thing that we've chosen to invest all our shit into, we've kind of played that shit out, and now it's kaput. Now it's bogus. Now what we need to do is we need to before it collapses, we need to be able to have a perspective that maybe by following this one line of development that goes in this one direction, we can view. This gives us a new perspective that we can see that we wouldn't have been able to see otherwise had we not taken this path. And then from this new perspective, we can reevaluate, perform a kind of a course correction, right? And then sort of to re-include other options into the sort of range, rather than making it this really narrow-minded thing where just one thing is selected at the expense of all the others, to rebalance for the sake of the overall integrity and stability long-term of the total system. Right? All right, thanks for watching.